Humans have long been fascinated with the idea of vampires, from Nosferatu to Edward Cullen, the sparkly vampire. Vampires have come in many shapes and sizes with a wide range of abilities and weaknesses, such as sparkle. Despite the many different depictions of vampires, there are a few key characteristics that they almost all universally share. Vampires are undead creatures, humans that died and have come back in vampire form. They have fangs and they need to drink blood in order to survive. They have incredible powers of regeneration and biological immortality. They possess heightened senses and often are telepathic or have supernatural powers. It all sounds like a fairly good trade-off for having to drink blood, doesn't it? Traditionally, the vampire has been depicted as a supernatural being. Because of this, imbuing them with abilities like transforming into animals, flight, and hypnotism was no big deal. Apparently, the writer of today's episode thought that this was the science fiction of fantasy. Where are we going, Kevin? One of the first works to depict vampires as a creation of nature rather than magic was Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. In the novel, the vampire apocalypse is caused by a bacteria that spread rapidly at first through sandstorms and then from vampires turning other humans by eating them. And this is why it's the science of science fiction. Boom. Suddenly I'm totally okay with it. The bacteria itself can be killed by both garlic and sunlight, taking the host body with them. But Matheson's version of vampirism is nothing magical, despite the vampires displaying odd behaviors. These were explained as a result of a psychiatric disorder known as hysterical blindness. The vampires appeared in mirrors and the Bible couldn't hurt them, but they were still terrified of these objects because they believed they were supposed to be. Likewise, one vampire is seen climbing a lamppost and then jumping off it, falsely believing that they will somehow turn into a bat. By combining elements of both biology and psychology, Matheson tried to create a seemingly realistic depiction of how vampires could exist in the real world. But was he right? Is there a scientifically plausible way for a human to turn into a vampire? Not meant for this world. And the short answer is no. Thank you so much for what it's going to be a little click off in my retention graph, isn't there? But that's okay. Look, it goes deeper than that. So no, it's not possible for a human to become a vampire. This probably shouldn't come as a surprise because we know that vampires aren't real, and the etymology of the word vampire has been extremely and thoroughly researched and chronicled. Even before vampire was the preferred nomenclature, the myths of humans turning into blood-sucking demons are well known. Thanks to our understanding of these myths and the contemporary rationale that would have led to their creation, we can safely say that at no point in human history have vampires ever existed. Shocking, we know. And look, of course, there was fiction about us traveling to the moon long before that was possible, so why does the current non-existence of vampires have to preclude the possibility? And that is a fair question that we've asked ourselves, but the impossibility of vampires is actually strictly biological. There are two main things in play that cement the notion of vampires as being purely fictional. The first is that vampires are dead. Technically speaking, they are undead, but well, that's not a real thing that exists, so we have to stick to the term dead. Traditionally, vampires die before turning, and that's not biologically possible for a human to do without quickly decaying and becoming rather useless, like a literal decaying corpse. Now, even if it were possible for an animated corpse to somehow function, the body would still technically be dead. Vampires are depicted as being pale and cold to the touch, and they don't need to breathe to survive. And you know that we say here they don't need to breathe to survive rather than don't breathe, because if they were incapable of breathing, they would also be incapable of speech. Now, regardless, all of this supports the hypothesis that they are indeed supposed to be dead. If the body is already dead, it means that it is no longer performing metabolism. This seems to contradict the need to drink blood as nourishment, as an organism with no metabolism would not need to metabolize anything for energy. But when vampires consume blood, it powers them through a magical process, and because magic is real, this isn't real, and therefore it can never be real. Again, shocking. But let's pretend for a moment that instead of dying and coming back as a vampire, a human was changed as a result of some sort of infection, like in I Am Legend. How much more possible does that make this entire thing? Well, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, not much. Virtually every depiction of vampires requires them to drink blood. There are two exceptions. The first are energy vampires who survive by draining psychic energy from a victim in order to survive. It may feel like Colin Robinson, that boring guy in the next cubicle, is draining all of your energy every day at work, but once again, this version of vampirism would require magic. So, well, again, this is the science of science fiction and not the science of fantasy. That's not real. It's not gonna work. The other exception to the blood drinking rule is Bunnicula, a children's book about a vampire rabbit who sucks the juices out of vegetables. That's not nearly as outlandish, but we're trying to focus on human vampires here rather than a kid's book, so let's carry on. Since every other depiction of vampires necessitates at least some amount of drinking blood for survival, this creates a major problem for us because, well, blood, despite us being a large part made of it, is toxic. And the reason for this is that blood in our veins really different to blood in our stomachs. The key problem here is iron. We need some amount of iron to survive, but blood has entirely too much iron in it for us to consume. Drinking anything beyond a couple of teaspoons of blood at very infrequent intervals can easily result in an overdose of iron known as HEMOCHROMATOSIS. If not addressed, this condition can cause severe damage to the liver, lungs, and heart, among other serious complications. It can even be fatal. This is before even taking into account the possibility of contracting blood-borne diseases. Now, our bodies are not designed to drink blood, which means they aren't built to deal with all of that excess iron that we ingest. And since we aren't equipped to expel that iron, hemochromatosis would be absolutely guaranteed. And look, when the one thing that vampires need to survive is something that would kill humans, it's pretty hard to make any arguments in favor of people turning into real-life vampires. Vampires from space. Alright, so humans can't be turned into vampires. We've established that. Our biology simply doesn't allow it, and no bacteria or virus is going to be able to change our physiology such that our bodies can expel excess iron so that we can feast on blood. But does that mean the concept of a vampire is impossible? Evolution takes a really long time, and since humans didn't evolve into anything resembling vampires, it is unlikely that this would ever occur on Earth. And God only knows what sort of environment pressures us to evolve into blood-sucking creatures of the night. But there are an estimated 700 quintillion planets in the universe, and it's a near statistical impossibility that we live on the only one of them that has any form of life. So, is there a chance that somewhere out there in the universe, humanoid creatures evolved to possess the characteristics of vampires? Well, by examining other animals here on Earth, it certainly seems like the answer could be yes. Vampire bats may have been named in honor of the mythical creature, but there's a good reason for it. They are the only mammals that feed exclusively on blood. Like their supernatural counterparts, vampire bats also have a seemingly unquenchable thirst, needing to feed on large amounts of blood every 2 days in order to survive. Since we know this trait already exists in nature, it could definitely appear somewhere else. Next on the list is heightened senses. Our senses aren't as bad compared to the rest of the animal kingdom as people are generally led to believe, but they're hardly the best. Birds of prey have some of the best vision around, able to see incredible distances. Goats have a 360-degree field of vision and can even see ultraviolet light. The list of animals with superior night vision to humans is too long to even get into. Bears can smell food from 18 to 20 miles away. The aforementioned vampire bats have infrared sensors to find the best point on an animal to attack so that it can drink the blood. And elephants have some of the best hearing in the world. Depending on how we define heightened senses, this is a pretty easy hurdle to cross. As long as the vampires have at least one sense that is superior to ours, it could be counted, and there are innumerable examples in the animal kingdom of animals that have at least one sense that is more powerful than those of a human. You're not going to see some creature that bursts into flames upon contact with direct sunlight, but there are plenty of nocturnal animals and photosensitive animals that will avoid sunlight at any cost. Subterranean animals and those that live deep in caves are adapted to the dark, so they will generally avoid the light. Even animals that typically live in the open like cattle and other livestock have increased photosensitivity as a result of ingesting certain types of plants. Instead of avoiding sunlight entirely, alien vampires and yes, we're really making a video about this, could have developed a defense mechanism against sunlight similar to other animals we see on Earth. Hippos, for example, secrete a form of natural sunscreen to protect their skin from burning. Rather than avoiding the sun, these vampires could secrete a chemical that not only protects their skin, but gives them the appearance of sparkling in direct sunlight. Yes! Twilight was right! So now we get to the regenerative capabilities and biological immortality that a supposed vampire would need to possess. These are things that we see are possible in the animal world, though there are no mammals that possess these abilities. Not that there's anything that says these vampires would need to be mammals anyway. Reptiles are famous for being able to regrow their tails and sometimes even their limbs. Salamanders can regrow an entire leg complete with bone and muscle tissue. Many invertebrates are able to regenerate their entire body from just their head, or even from nothing but a few blood vessels. Among the vertebrates that possess these regenerative powers, none is more impressive than the axolotl. This aquatic salamander can not only regenerate limbs, but also its spinal cord, heart, and other organs. Then there's the famous immortal jellyfish, a sea creature that has achieved biological immortality by having the ability to revert to an earlier stage in its developmental cycle to repair damage from trauma or just from the effects of aging. This isn't quite how we envision vampire immortality, as they are generally viewed as frozen in time, never aging. Still, it does show us that there is a precedent in nature for a creature that needs to actively be killed, otherwise it'll just live forever. And look, we have no idea what life on another planet is going to look like, and it's impossible for us to even guess what sort of environment would be necessary to force a human-shaped creature down an evolutionary path that included all of the above traits. What we do know is that aside from supernatural abilities like shapeshifting and telepathy, all of the characteristics of a vampire already exist somewhere in nature, just spread out across different species. Look, it may be too late for us humans to ever become vampires, but it is possible that vampires were a natural step in the evolutionary process, just somewhere else out in the vastness of the universe. The only difference between traditional depictions of these vampires, besides the lack of magic, would be that these exist as an entire species rather than as some abnormality or disease that could be transmitted via biting. But what if they were real? So, would a vampire population even be sustainable? Now, there are no hard and fast rules on how exactly vampire feeding works, so this is going to be a little tough to calculate. For the easiest example, let's assume that a vampire must feed once per night and that doing so turns that person into a vampire. This results in exponential population growth, and assuming every vampire succeeds in feeding every night, there would be over 500 million vampires in just a single month. Considering that vampires can't survive by feeding on each other, that's not even a remotely sustainable rate of population growth. Given the vampires are immortal, any steady increase in population over time will become unsustainable relatively quickly. The initial example may have been the most dramatic, but the results will always be the same. Even if only 10% of vampire bites result in death and 5% result in creating a new vampire, after 6 months that would already be over 2,000 vampires and over 4,000 dead, resulting from a single vampire. After a full year, 4 million vampires, 16 million dead. In any scenario where the vampires were not either strictly regulated, routinely hunted, or had a population-wide sense of self-control, the population would explode to a rate that was unsustainable by the number of remaining humans, resulting in one or both of these populations dying off completely. So while a race of vampires could theoretically exist on another planet, as Sony tragically learned, here on Earth, it is not, nor will it ever be, Morbin time.